Hi everybody, Aaron Stein here, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and I want to give everybody a sneak preview of one of our new members-only podcasts called Unspent Rounds, which features interesting conversations with interesting people. On this snippet of the show, I spoke with Adam A.I. Sullivan, who is an airfield operations flight commander and who also oversaw the withdrawal from Afghanistan from the ground. If you're not yet a member and you want to hear the rest of the show, head on over to www.warontherocks.com/membership. Adam, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks. Proud to be here.
Well, I think maybe we should start. We were talking a little bit off the podcast. I am curious where the call sign AI comes from. I think listeners will understand that you're in the Air Force, and we'll come back to your role in that in a second. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My call sign is AI. It stands for artificial intelligence. I got it back in tech school. So tech school for what I do as an airfield operations officer is I go through a bunch of smaller tech schools, if you will, for air traffic control, airfield management, and RAWS, which is radar and airfield weather systems. Anyway, during that time, you have to be able to compute a lot of data and to figure out scenarios pretty quickly, and then also do that with your people that you're training with, and hopefully to train with different people in different roles. And so try to not to repeat all of that. I kind of came up with a system and just did it up really quick and said, like, all right, cool, this is how we're going to do to help so we're not like repeating all the same stuff, or like, I met with somebody or trained with somebody in that similar position. So anyway, after all that was done, they were just like, man, there's like a walking computer. So AI stuck. And so in air traffic control and airfield management, we do control initials as well. So it just also worked really well. So AI is my control initials, but also my call sign.
All right. Well, that's a good background to set the scene. You are in airfield management, and you were managing the evacuation of the Kabul airport, were you not?
That is correct. Yes, that was primarily my job. Yes.
I mean, I think listeners will be familiar with the history, which is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan ultimately goes badly, and then requiring this massive airlift to get people out of the country. Let's start right there. What was your role in all this, and how'd you end up in Kabul?
My role in all that is essentially to try to have everything in a more cohesive. And so prior to getting there, it was pretty maybe subsection out. I don't know if that's the right word, but people were doing different aspects of that job, and it was very decentralized, if you will. And so there was a lot of information that was either falling through the cracks or just not. It wasn't as efficient as it could have been, right? So prior to going, I was already deployed in the Middle East, and hearing that this was going on, and they were asking for volunteers essentially to go help out. Mostly they were asking for my air traffic controllers, but also looking through the list of what they were looking for. They didn't have much in the form of airfield management or as a 13 mic or an airfield operations officer to kind of combine all that information, both the knowledge of air traffic and knowledge of airfield management, into one. So bringing that idea up to my squadron leadership and group leadership while I was deployed, and then presenting that into the CENTCOM or CENTCOM AFCENT. And they all agreed and said, yeah, that actually makes brilliant sense. Let's send a 13 mic that has consolidated all that information to kind of help out everybody there. So when I got there, first job was to find out who's in charge and where I can fit in. But it was pretty easy to find who was in charge. Talk to him. It was Colonel Cyrus. He was the main Air Force lead there, and just kind of linking up with him and asking him, like, hey, where do you need me to plug in? And essentially he put me over. He asked me to go to the Turkish. They were running the air show, or not the air show, the airfield, if you will. And so talking with them and kind of getting a grasp of what they were handling, how things were going, is my initial role in starting out.
Had the evacuation started at this point, or was it beforehand? And, I guess who was in charge? Because I do know the Turks were running the airport, but who was like doing the day-to-day of clearing flights and all that stuff?
Prior to me getting there and the volunteer, right, that was a couple of weeks. So that was the beginning of August. And then we finally get the clear to go. And then we get the intel brief that Monday of that viral video that happened. That happened on Monday. And I got there Wednesday. I think it was Wednesday night I got there. So it was just like days after the viral incident that happened. And up until that point, I think it was like that was the only C-17 that had taken off with any kind of form of refugees, to my knowledge, at that point. And so when I got there, not many aircraft have either come in or gone out, or the ones that have come in weren't taking any evacuees, refugees out at that point, to my knowledge. So working again with the Turks, kind of seeing how they approve, how they talk to the aircraft, what's the ground movement look like, how much space are we working with? Yeah, essentially, who's coming in, who's going out, what are they taking, what are they bringing in, that sort of stuff. On the ground, in terms of the tower, because there's nobody in the actual tower in Kabul, because it was ransacked on that Monday. And so there was no computers, there was no screens, all this stuff was smashed out. The radios were okay because they were stored in a separate location. But the Marines at the time, they were working our makeshift tower, if you will. It was basically any kind of like a pop-up tent that you go buy at Costco or any other Walmart, something like that you just throw up and just kind of create some semblance of shade. And they took a chair and sat down and started talking on their radios that reach out 10, 15 miles or whatever. We call them LMRs. But anyway, the Marines were working the tower airspace, if you will, to bring them in. They were landing. It was a single runway, and we only had a ramp with about 10 parking spaces that could fit 10 C-17s, if you will. So not a lot of space to work with, and a lot of, like I said, a lot of decentralization because people were doing just different aspects of the job, whether approving people to come in, where they were going to park, what they were bringing in, who was going to bring them out, all that sort of information. So working with the Turks, like I said, it was complicated, and they weren't doing things efficiently or as efficiently as I thought they could have gone. And bringing that up to Colonel Cyrus, who is, the lead for the Air Force unit there, and essentially telling him how I believe that we can improve operations, because they were approving only certain aircraft to come in and not others. And asking about that, they didn't really give me a good enough answer, if you will. So going to Colonel Cyrus, bringing up that information, I think within hours after that, the Turkish were no longer running the airfield, and we as in the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Military, took over what is called the Senior Airfield Authority, or SAA. So we took over the SAA, Senior Airfield Authority, and at that point we took over all the aircraft that were coming in or requesting to come in. We call them PPRs, or prior permission required. It's a standard form or essentially information that pilots use to go fly to request to land in certain airfields, at least for the military. So that was the very beginning, taking that process over. It was definitely ruffled some feathers, specifically the Turkish general that was there, and he got really mad that I was telling him that he wasn't doing a good enough job and I was taking over.
The viral video you're talking about, I assume, is when people were trying to physically hold on to the C-17. Do I have that correct?
That is correct.
So it seemed like there was two issues, and maybe you could speak to this. It's one is that there was no security at the site, right? And so people were able to walk up, I guess that was to the runway, and were able to get in the position to hang on to a C-17, which was obviously tragic, but underscores, I guess, the desperation of the people in that case. And then two was the actual operations of the coming and going of flights. How chaotic really was it?
The entire time I was there, very chaotic. I think I slept a few hours a day. I was working 18 hours to 20 hours a day, especially that first couple, 2 or 3 days. I don't really remember sleeping, nor do my guys. But like you were alluding to, there was not much security in the form on that Monday. If those that are unfamiliar with the Kabul International Airport, it's actually shared by essentially the civilian side. So the international airport is down on the south, if I remember correctly. And so down on the south, that's where they entered the airfield, passed through essentially where you'd go through, get checked by security and wait at your terminal, and you're just kind of waiting for the planes to come in so you can board your aircraft. So they breach that area, go out onto the runway or airfield, pass the infield, pass the runway, and then start essentially invading, is better, lack of a better word, right? The northern side, which is held by the Turkish, and where we were at. So the actual Kabul base for us. So they starting up more walking up at that point. And this is just stuff that people have told me. I wasn't physically there. Like I said, I showed up on that Wednesday. But yeah, so they'd come through the south. We weren't in control at that point in time. We were kind of just controlling our section, which is up to the north, in that particular piece of pavement, that 10 parking spot ramp, and that's where we were holding. So yeah, it was very, very chaotic at that time. And then coming in, just kind of, again, those first few days of figuring out who is going to do what, and then start centralizing that control, and then moving on from there.
At some point, there is some semblance of security that's established. I believe it was by the Marine Corps. You can correct me if I'm not remembering correctly. And then it was the process of getting aircraft in and getting aircraft out. Can you describe, I guess what that was like? Because I guess there's two narratives, and both can be true. Is that one is that the collapse was faster than anybody anticipated, and that perhaps the withdrawal wasn't the best idea. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. But then the other one was that the actual evacuation, once it got up to speed, was done very efficiently. So maybe you can talk a little bit about once everything was, I guess, consolidated, once security and a perimeter was established, what the process was like to get flights in and out and to get people boarded onto these aircraft.
Like you said, Marines took control of the perimeter, and Army was also helping supplement that kind of aspect as well. So Marines Army was in charge of security and the perimeter, and essentially checking the refugees that were coming in from off base, and then we were not housing them, but holding them within the base in various locations. And that the Marines were in charge of essentially vetting, making sure, and consolidating, and then getting essentially a PAX manifest ready to go, so that when aircraft were ready to start taking refugees out, that they'd have them essentially pre-ready to go, that they can just start walking them onto the aircraft. So prior to that, Air Force's job, or my job, essentially was to create an airflow plan. And so working with AFCENT and TACC. Again, I'm not 100% sure what TACC is, what the acronym is for, but it's basically the mobility. They kind of track all the big tankers or the C-17s and the airlift movements, and so they kind of schedule with that. And so working with them, we started creating an airflow plan, essentially, to bring these aircraft in. And it took a little while, and using the PPR process, right, of both NATO allies, non-NATO allies, anybody that had, cargo type aircraft to come in, bring or take refugees out. And so working with a lot of different people, I was on the phone constantly, and not only approving, but working with a bunch of people of when they were going to come in, where they were going to park, and how many people they could take out. And so initially it was very, very chaotic because, like I said, I was on the phone constantly talking with anybody and everybody, and taking over the PPR process. It was a lot of pots in the fire, if you will, juggling a lot of different things and trying to coordinate everything to work on this 10 parking ramp space, which is not a lot considering, I think at the height of the movement, I think we brought in over 150 C-17s in a single day, I think is what it was, on the very pinnacle. And so with 10 parking spots, that's a lot of moving pieces, right? So coordinating all that took a little bit, but once we got everything, essentially it was a Google Doc. I don't know if you've read the link, or not a link, but there's a recent article by Task and Purpose that kind of alludes to that, the Google Doc, essentially. And so basically what we set up is essentially that. I was tired of talking on the phone and missing a bunch of information that was coming in via email, phone calls, and all that sort of stuff, that to remove a lot of ambiguity, if you will, it was important for everybody to know who was coming in, when they were coming in, where they're going to park, and everybody needed that information all at once, all the time. And the only way that I knew how to do that without sharing my screen or doing what all that was to set up a Google document, giving people view-only access and only a few handful of people to input that data, myself included, with a couple other Marines that were helping out, and a few other Air Force personnel. But But yeah, that was essentially it. We put in the information of who was coming, their call sign, where they're coming from, if they were bringing any supplies in, how much of that, and then if the type of aircraft, again, what time they were coming in, where they were going to park, and then at the later on stages, we put in the information of how many refugees were able to be loaded on, and we broke that down to like men, women, and children, and so with the very detailed analysis, if you will. So that Google Doc was shared with a lot of people. I think there were a few hundred people on that Google Doc sheet that could view, and I'm sure there's people were doing their own analysis on that, but I was just putting in that information on a daily basis, hourly basis, minute basis.
I had not read that Task and Purpose article about the Google Doc, but it is an efficient way to share data across multiple screens. Us at War on the Rocks uses Google all the time. So, you're sort of talking about like the very, like I guess to say, like the efficient way that you do this, right? So you bring planes in, you get passenger manifests, you upload the passenger manifest, you get people on, and you just keep turning it, and so that you turn it and burn so that you keep those parking spaces as free as possible. Meanwhile, the world, me included, are watching the scenes at the gates, right? So like, how aware were you about what was going on as people were trying to get in? And I'll ask about the suicide bombing later, but like just sort of building to that. And what's it like, and I guess attached to that, there was credible imagery of, I guess, gunfire at some C-17s that were coming out of Kabul. So what's the security situation, before the suicide bombing?
Very tense. You could feel essentially the day that I got there. Yes, it was very tense in a different way, but every day that we got there and we were getting closer and closer to that deadline of where we needed to get out, you could feel the tension. You can almost cut it walking to the office from where you slept and going to the office. And from where I was at, I believe it was the TOC. It was the Marine headquarters, and I just had a very small corner in the very corner of the building in that main central hub. And we got, or at least that area got, and so I overhear a lot of the intel briefs that was going on and updates that was happening on at the gates and the perimeters and stuff like that. So at least I knew what was going on for the most part. And you definitely hear gunfire almost constantly throughout the day, throughout the night. There was stuff that was going on that you just kind of had to, at least for me, I just put it at the back of my mind and just kind of go through it. But I remember that first night, couple of nights, but yeah, essentially falling asleep to the sound of gunfire or something going on, because it was where I was sleeping. It was not too far from like the perimeter wall, and stuff that was going on outside of that was on a daily, nightly basis that stuff was going on. And so it was, you wore your battle rattle to and from work or going to the office, if you will. It was only a few hours of a day that I took any of that stuff off. So it was, but it was for our own protection because there was obviously a very credible threat just, a few 100 meters away.
Yeah, there was this weird dynamic, and I don't know if you can speak to this, about the Taliban themselves. What were the Taliban saying as this were going in? Because they were nominally in control. I guess the entire situation was out of control, but they were occupying Kabul at that time as we were running the evacuation. Who was handling that, and did that like filter down to you in any sort of way about overseeing the flight operations to get people out?
All I was told was down in the south, the Taliban essentially has set up a checkpoint so that nobody could really access the international airport from that side. That was pretty much as far as I knew. I can go into detail and later on, like you said, with the suicide bombing later, but it was also part of my job to talk to the Taliban, to chat with them and tell them how to run an airfield after we leave. So in the middle of the, trying to maintain this, airfield, maintain this, the airspace. The airspace is another thing too that my guys helped do. We actually expanded not Marines, but expanded our control of the airspace out to about 65 miles. Whereas beforehand, we were only talking maybe about 5 miles out. And like you said, there was, shots at C-17s. There was a couple of instances where they sent flares because they were getting targeted by surface-to-air missiles. Nothing that launched from my knowledge or from what I remember. But they did launch mini flares then as they were taking off, just to kind of prevent, getting shot down from who knows what that was trying to target them.
Thanks everybody for listening for this sneak preview of Unspent Rounds. There's a lot more where that came from. If you want to hear the end of this conversation and all of future conversations, which come out every Wednesday for War on the Rocks members, head on over to warontherocks.com/membership and sign up now.